as I was saying, we're going to practice Tonglen tonight. I'm going to say a few things before we meditate. For the benefit of anybody who's new to this kind of practice, to try to help you conceptualize what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then we'll meditate, then we'll have some discussion. So the reality that we live in, the fact is, just all of this unavoidable pain that we are faced with as human beings. And it's just the reality. There's just all of this unavoidable unpleasantness. You can reflect, like, how much unpleasantness did you experience today? Whether it's, and pain is everywhere from subtle annoyance, discomfort, to, some of the almost unbearable experiences that we have. And of course, this is the Buddha's first noble truth, that there's all of this suffering that is just normal and natural and kind of a given of that we have. If we take birth, you incarnate, you are here as a person, a human. Suffering is part of the deal. And we suffer about our pain. And the Buddha, there's this huge Buddhist promise, you know it, right? It's why you're here. You can end suffering. The Buddha's teaching, it's possible for us human beings through our own efforts in this lifetime to learn how to not suffer. That's a fucking awesome promise. That's an awesome, I didn't know that before I started practicing. I didn't know that there was any possibility of not suffering, but this is the core teaching of the Buddha. He starts with saying suffering is normal, normalizing it rather than it's somehow you're doing something wrong, somehow it's a moral failing, or you're just not rich enough, or whatever ideas you have about why you suffer. The Buddha says this is just for everyone. The rich people suffer, the poor people suffer, the privileged people suffer, the oppressed people suffer. Everyone suffers. Everyone has suffering. It just comes with incarnation. And there's levels of it. And very important for us all to get our minds around, there's a difference between unpleasantness, pain, difficulty, and suffering. Because if the Buddha's third noble truth said, you can free yourself from pain, then we'd all just be like, well, this is bullshit. Hopefully, you'd have enough common sense to be like, that's not possible. But for some reason, this promise of freedom from suffering often gets misinterpreted, misunderstood, and we turn it into this idea that my life shouldn't be unpleasant, that I shouldn't have pain, I shouldn't experience difficulties if I get spiritual, wise, compassionate enough. The bad news is that no matter how compassionate we get, compassion doesn't get rid of our pain. Compassion is how we learn to meet our pain, how we learn to meet other people's pain, how we learn to skillfully respond to pain. And rather than suffering about pain and turning it into, I hate this, I'm afraid of this, I despise it, I can't bear it, we learn to bear pain. And it really does. It really starts with tolerance and forbearance. And then it goes slowly over the meditation practice to an experience of mercy. We learn to be merciful towards our own pain. And mercy means to not create suffering or cause harm in a situation where you have the power to do so, to refrain from kicking your own ass is a merciful act. To refrain from hurting anybody else that you have the power to hurt is an act of mercy. It's not quite compassion, right? Because you don't have to be really caring and loving and friendly and compassionate to just say, I'm just not going to kick my own ass right now. I'm just not going to hurt myself or hurt someone else even more. It's an act of mercy. So my experience has been, and I believe this is how it works for most of us, is that there's a very gradual shift from the default, which is I hate pain, I love pleasure. And I do everything that I can to avoid pain, and I suffer about pain, and I am afraid of pain, and I, live my life fueled by this aversion. That's the default, right? And you see the youngest babies just born into this aversion to pain. It's our survival instinct. Nobody had to teach you to hate pain. You're just, your nervous system, your, whatever, evolution, natural selection, there's a procreate, this drive to find pleasure, avoid pain. It's just naturally how we're all wired. But unfortunately, so we're born with the causes of suffering in us, the aversion to pain. We're not born with self-compassion. Nobody is. It's not just because of your fucked up childhood. It's not just because of the traumas you experienced. Nobody is. The Dalai Lama, who's the supposed 14th incarnation of this wise being, this king in Tibet. He said, I had to develop compassion. He said, it took me decades. They took him to the monastery when he was like 4 years old. And he grew up in the monastery practicing. He's like, and after about 10 years, when I was a teenager, I started to feel a little bit. And then in my 20s, I had a little bit more compassion. In my 30s and my 40s, he said, every decade or so, I can look back and be like, I'm becoming a little bit more compassionate. Which is interesting, for us to understand that about someone like the Dalai Lama, who we often project, perfection, and he's a Buddha, and the Tibetan people tend to worship the Dalai Lama and say he's a reincarnation of Chenrezig, the Buddha of compassion. And he says, that's what they say about me. But the reality is, he's like, I live with my own mind, and my own mind is not compassionate all of the time. He said after 60 or 70 years of doing compassion, Tonglen practice, these kind of development of compassion, uncovering, he said, I'm kind of way better at it. I have a consistent ability to be compassionate, but not all of the time. And so this is important for our own humility and whatever way that we judge our inability to be compassionate all of the time, to remember that even someone like His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, readily admits, he's like, I can't do it all the time. Sometimes I just get pissed. And I've seen him yell at people before, seen him just like yelling at his translator and just like, you're fucking up. It's not what I said. And I think that's important for us to like humanize and say like, okay, we're trying to develop this really radical, counter-instinctual response. Our instincts are, it hurts, get mad about it, suffer about it. Not, it hurts, tolerate it, accept it, be really loving towards it. Like, maybe some of you are better than others, better than me at being really compassionate to others. And I hear this often. People come in to the Dharma and they're like, I'm good at compassion for everyone else. I totally care about everyone else. But my own pain, compassion for self, for the body, the heart, the mind, feels elusive. That was my experience when I started practicing. And I've seen, 3 decades or so into the practice, I've seen a shift, an increase, more tolerance. I became good at tolerating pain. I was totally intolerant. Sitting meditation is so good with the achy knees and the sore back and the, pain in the shoulders or whatever. Just doing retreats and just learning like, okay, I can just sit here and be uncomfortable. Do it every day. Increases our tolerance for discomfort. And then starting to be merciful of like, oh, I see internally when I meet it with hatred, anger, and fear, I suffer. When I accept it and meet it with mercy, I have the power to accept this moment just as it is and not make it worse. With mindfulness, we have the power, I think. You know what I mean by that? That without mindfulness, I'm not so sure people even have the free will to choose compassion. Reflect on that for a moment. Like before can you really, without really training your mind in mindfulness of seeing, oh, this is unpleasant and I'm meeting it with aversion, without the awareness of what's happening on such a subtle level all of the time. Because when we're talking about unpleasantness and pain and the need for compassion, it's at all of the sense doors. Unpleasant sights call for compassion. You see something, you're like, oh, I wish I didn't see that. So painful to see that. Unpleasant sounds, your perception of something that's really too loud, too fast, too nails on a chalkboard. Is a great example of like just that, oh, what a painful sound. Or unpleasant smells. When was the last time you were in a porta potty? As a meditation practice, as like, okay, this is really unpleasant. Can I tolerate it? Can I accept it? This is, anytime you go into a porta potty, it's a compassion practice. Breathing in suffering. Breathing out compassion, or you can just sit there and hate it and suffer about it and try to hold your breath. I mean, I'm not encouraging like long, deep, slow breaths in the porta potty, but you know what I'm saying, right? Like all of the sense doors met with unpleasantness regularly. How many unpleasant sounds did you hear today? Smells, sights. And then there's all of this physical sensation. Like, are you uncomfortable yet? You've been sitting here for 20 minutes. Is your ass starting to hurt yet? It will if you sit still, right? And if you don't sit still, it will you'll be shifting to get away from it. Really interesting experiment is to take a posture or, and then see that you won't, every movement, every time we scratch, every time we stretch, every time we move our body, it's because we're trying to get away from something that's at least subtly uncomfortable, or trying to move towards something we think will be more pleasant. And we're constantly moving. Have you ever heard that thing about how people touch their face? In COVID, we've sort of learned, oh, I better not touch my face all of the time. But it's a striking number, like over 100 times a day we touch our face. I'm like, why do you touch your face? Why do you itch? I'm always like, fixing my glasses, like rubbing my head, doing something. And, it's all at least some subtle level of aversion to discomfort and or the craving, the idea, oh, that'll just feel pleasant. It'll just feel good. Everything that we do is driven by this. Just about everything. Long-winded way of explaining that we have to develop compassion. We have to uncover it. There is a perspective that I have shared several times during the course of this book, Monday Nights, that in every single one of us, there is a compassionate heart. It's what the Tibetans would call your Buddha nature: wisdom, compassion, kindness, generosity. It's part of human, I want to say nature, Buddha nature, but it's really more a potential. It's there, it's dormant, it's at our core. But just because it's there doesn't mean we actually have any access to it. Doesn't mean we actually feel it. Doesn't mean we actually are in tune or in harmony with the compassionate heart. And so these practices are to uncover it, to many of our communities in recovery from addiction. And I've always had that question of like, well, recover what? My traumatic childhood? No, thanks. But this Buddhist view is recover your wise heart. Uncover it. Recover something that's always been there. And when you experience compassion, it doesn't feel foreign. It feels like, oh, yeah, okay. It's always been here. I just wasn't really quite, I've never been in that room of my house before. I knew it was there, but I've never, been in there. But this is just part of my home. This is part of the term divine abodes is how the Buddha, or what's translated, is that compassion is this wise, this divine place that's part of your abode. It's part of your home. It's part of who you are, who we are. So we'll meditate in a moment. I'll share this, because sometimes you do this meditation, and my experience with the loving kindness, the compassion, the forgiveness, what we call the heart practices, in the beginning was like, this shit's not only not working, it's making it worse. As I turn towards my pain, it hurts more. And I'm meditating to try to get free from this suffering, and it feels like it's making me suffer more. My father used to say, he said, here's how it works. Every unskillful reaction that you have, unskillful being, I'll give you 3 categories of unskillful reactions. One is aversion. Anytime you meet something with, I hate this, I can't tolerate it, I got to get away from it, it's annoying, when you meet pain with unskillful, or any clinging, anytime you get attached. And third one, anytime you take anything really personal, self, I, me, mine. So how many times today did you unskillfully take something personal, including your own mind, your own thoughts, your own emotions, meet something with aversion, or cling to something, get attached? I want this to stay. I want it to be different than it is, not impermanent. I want it to be permanent. So we do it hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a day. He said, each unskillful, he said, think of it as like a sheet of rice paper. You know how thin a sheet of rice paper is? It's made out of rice. It's super thin. You can flick it and put a hole in it. Like, those things are actually supposed to be rice paper, the shoji screens. They're plastic actually, but traditionally they're made out of paper, and you hit it and you break it. Or if you put it in water, it'll kind of like start to dissolve because it's that thin. He said, think of every unskillful moment that we naturally all have all day, every day, without training our minds. That's just the default. He said, that's a sheet of rice paper over your heart, over the compassionate heart. I hate this. I want that. It's all my fault. It's all about me, over and over and over. And this layers and layers and layers of rice paper until it's impenetrable, until we don't have any access to our compassionate heart. So in the Tonglen, every time you breathe in and you think, breathing in the suffering, I'm breathing out compassion towards suffering, it's melting a layer of rice paper. Even if you don't feel shit, even if it makes it worse, it's still melting a layer of defense, of armoring, of rice paper, those thin, unskillful, habitual reactions we all have. And if you do it for months and years, you melt it, melt it, melt it, melt it, and you free your heart from being so defended. And you uncover compassion, and you learn mercy, and you learn to be more tolerant and patient and accepting and friendly towards our own pain, as well as the pain of others. Speaking a lot about ourselves, of course, this practice, and especially in the Tibetan perspective, is about compassion for all sentient beings, not just yourself, all beings. Learning to care even about our enemies, even about the people that we think are the worst and don't deserve any compassion because they're so ignorant, they're so evil, they're so unskillful. This practice says, let's go all the way to even having compassion for the most unskillful, for the most deranged. Let's see their pain. Let's learn to care about it. Does it make sense? I'll give a guided meditation and we'll go through it, but I feel like some setup is good. All right, so it's good to be uncomfortable. You have plenty of suffering to breathe in. Find a way to sit that is rigid and uptight. I'm just joking. Relaxed and upright. Find a way just to be that. Allowing your eyes to close and your arms to rest in your lap or on your legs. Making any adjustments necessary, and then just taking your posture, your meditation pose, softening the brow, the eyes, the jaw. Releasing the shoulders, the heart, the belly. And begin with anything unpleasant that's happening right now. If there's any even subtle pains, discomforts in your body, breathe them into the heart center. And breathe out the intention to meet your own pain with compassion. Breathing in the sensations in the achy knees or back. Breathing out compassion and softening tension around any aches in the body. And begin to reflect on your day, using your mind to reflect. What was challenging today? Moments of stress. Painful smells, sights, sounds. With each breath, breathing in what's challenging, what's hard to bear, what's unpleasant in your life throughout your day today. Breathing into the heart center, melting the sheet of rice paper, and exhaling compassion, just the intention. And sometimes I simply say in my mind, may I learn to care about this pain rather than faking it. May I learn to have compassion for my own pain. From the big challenges to the subtle annoyances. And then just begin for reflecting back on this incarnation, the difficulties, the pains, the sufferings, the losses, the sorrow you've experienced so far. Acknowledging it, turning towards, breathing it into your heart, breathing out compassion towards all of the pain of relationships, the physical pains, the injuries, the illnesses. Traditionally, there's a visualization aspect to this meditation where you visualize the pain as like a smoke, like hot and heavy. And you visualize, you breathe in that kind of toxic cloud. And you breathe out a cooling, refreshing, clear. Compassion soothes it, transforms it. As you breathe out, also experiment with softening your belly, compassion, soft, cool. The intention to meet your whole life, all of the difficulties, childhood, adolescence, the suffering of craving, of aversion, of addiction. Breathing it into the heart center, breathing out compassion. The suffering of the body, of the heart, the suffering of the mind. So painful, this critical voice we all have, the judging, the comparing. The mind that experiences shame, the confusion we take on in our brains. Breathe it in to the heart. Breathe out compassion towards your own brain. And again, just come back to the present here, right now. These are just memories, just thoughts, creating sensations in the body. Keep breathing into the heart center, keep softening the belly. Return to any physical or emotional unpleasantness that's here now. Perhaps some grief, sadness, fear, aching knees or back. Breathe into it, soften around it. And exhale the soothing, cool, clear breath of compassion. Even if you don't feel it, it's just a visualization, just a practice. Just melting those sheets of rice paper over the heart. And then begin with the understanding that just as we have experienced so much pain, so many difficulties, continue to live with this aversive instinct. It's the same with everyone we know, all of our friends and family, also living with a mind that is critical, with a body that craves pleasure and hates pain. Bringing to mind the people that you care about, either in a group or one at a time, with the willingness to extend compassion to them by breathing in their pain, their difficulties into your heart center. And breathing out compassion towards their pain. In heavy, hot. Breathing out light, cool, soothing. Everyone you've ever met has suffered. Everyone we've ever met worthy of compassion. No matter how confused, perhaps unkind or unskillful they may have been towards you, their pain spilling out. Breathing in the pain, breathing out compassion. Extend beyond the people who you care about to some of the people that you don't care about so much, you resent. You judge, you fear. Allow yourself to see their pain, their confusion, their ignorance, their suffering. Allow yourself to breathe in their pain, their confusion, their suffering. And breathe out compassion, the intention to meet even our enemies, the other side, with mercy, with compassion. We do this not because they deserve it, but to free ourselves from the suffering of a defended heart. And begin expanding outward in all directions. Reflecting on this world, what you know of this world with the 8 billion humans, people being born and people dying, the young, the old, people from every race and ethnicity, culture, religion, every single human with this mind that judges and craves pleasure. Every single one experiencing the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. So as we breathe in the suffering of the world, expand your heart. Let your heart be as wide as the world. Not trying to breathe all of the suffering into your tiny little cardiac muscle, but the immense, compassionate nature of the awakened potential that's in each one of us. The visualizations don't work so well for you, that's okay. Just over and over remind yourself, breathing in the suffering of the world, breathing out compassion towards all sentient beings. as you begin to move, bring mindfulness to the relief and how the body's like, hey, get away from this unpleasantness. Stretch and feel the pleasantness of stretching, or having a drink of water, or whatever it is. The unpleasantness of a dry mouth. Yes, I made it extra cold in here tonight, so you had something to suffer about. You could turn the AC up a little bit, probably. Up, down, up. Less cold. Down, down. I don't have it anymore, but I used to have this great quote. I think it was an interview with this young Tibetan Lama or Rinpoche. And he was a teenager, but you know, the reincarnate of some wise teacher, supposedly. And they interview and you know, throw him into teaching really young. I think he was like 14 or something. And they're like, but he's this, you know, reincarnation of this Lama. So they, you know, put him up there, and everybody's coming to him for advice, and he's getting interviewed, and the interviewer asks him something like, so, you know, you're a 14-year-old kid, and he's growing up in the States, and I think it's like Montana or Wyoming or something, and this is like in the 90s, and he's growing up, and all of these students are seeing him as the reincarnated Lama, and that's my Lama. And he said, you know, students are always coming to me for advice, and so the interviewer says, well, what do you tell them? You know? He says, well, what do I know? I'm 14. He said, so I just teach them Tonglen. You know, I teach them just, you know, whatever's happening, breathe it in. Breathe it in. If you're suffering about something, breathe it in. Breathe out compassion. Breathe out the antidote to whatever's. He said, I basically just see myself as like a air conditioner repair dude. He said, because that's what we're doing, right? Like air conditioners, like they breathe in the hot air, they blow out cold air. He's like, that's what Tonglen is. And that's like pretty much all people need to learn. Breathe it in. Stop trying to run from it. Breathe it in hot. And cool it. That we have this, you know, I think what he would, you know, refer to as this Buddha nature, this compassionate heart potential that can chill out, that can cool it off. I like this image, this visualization from this Tibetan practice of breathing out cool. And it's also in the Theravada, in the third noble truth, the nirvana, this promise, you can reach nirvana. And what nirvana literally means is that you've been getting burned by greed and hatred and delusion, suffering, dukkha, suffering, greed for pleasure, hatred of pain, self-centered delusion are like flames. And nirvana means to remove yourself from getting burned, from getting cooked, and that it's an experience of cooling. And I was teaching this at one point, and an Indian person came up to me and they said, you know, we still use that term, nibbana, in cooking in India. He said, it's like a cooking term to mean like to take it out of the oven. And I was like, oh, I love how practical to get, right? To cool, to breathe the coolness, done cooking, take yourself out of the oven of hatred, out of the fire of clinging and of the self-centered tendency. Now, it's so much easier said than done, and it takes a long time to get very good at meeting our own pain with compassion. It's a skill, depending on how thick those wall we've built our life and our, you know, how much aversion we've been meeting our pain with, melting it, on, you know, dismantling it. taking off the armoring, for most takes some time. It's not a quick fix, for sure. I could probably go on, but what are your thoughts, questions, comments here in the room or at home? If you have a question at home, you can raise your hand. There's that little blue hand. I think it's on the dots or whatever color it is. I see a couple questions. There's a question here in the room I'll take first, but let's talk about compassion tonight. Austin, go ahead.
So I have a martyrdom complex, and as a result, I intertwine reward with suffering, and it's pretty sick, but it's just what it is. So anyway, as I'm trying to have compassion to myself, like on top of that, I'm breathing the cool air of compassion over top of this, like, this predicament that I have. I find myself feeling pity for myself. I don't know if I'm necessarily supposed to be feeling that. That's what I'm feeling, and that complexifies my woes. Woe is me, the martyr who, who's perverted suffering with reward, and I didn't mean to.
Right.
Obviously, there's nothing happens. So.
Yeah, we don't mean to do any of this shit, but it happens.
Should I defer from pity, or am I like,
Some would say that pity has some compassionate tendencies in it. Some would say it's the near enemy of compassion, that compassion is just caring about how painful it is to have this mind that does what it does and takes it all so personal, and that part of us that believes our mind, that's so the pity, that's the sort of woes me and I feel sorry for myself. There's it's not entirely, of course it's not wisdom, as you know, but it's not entirely unwholesome. There's something in there that is caring. And so it might be worth working with that pity and shifting it rather than trying to push it away, but shifting the pity to actual mercy. Because it is that part of your mind that's like, oh, this really sucks. This is really painful. This is really hard to bear.
But I'm like, I deserve that.
Yeah.
Reward time.
Reward time. There's something good on the other side of it. So I'm not so sure, but what I believe is true, and I hope is true, and you have to find out for yourself, is that these practices will rewire that experience that you're talking about of suffering and reward, and that slowly over the years, if you meditate daily and train your mind and see, two things will happen. One is that the interior, the landscape will shift some. And then also you'll just learn to not believe your mind so much when it's giving you all of that bad advice about, hey, you'll get some reward, or you should feel sorry for yourself, or you'll start to have that space around like, oh, my mind's not very trustworthy. Like we all kind of know that, right? Don't you? We all know that about our minds. It's like one of the first insights that you have of like, oh, my mind's kind of full of shit. But I still tend to believe it. Why is that? Why do I keep obeying this mind that has gotten to me into all of this trouble and said, hey, you should shoot dope, and you should commit crimes, and you should, whatever it has said, drink, run, suppress. Like all of that, like that was all advice from our, it's craving, but it's all of our mind is not so trustworthy, untrained mind, not so trustworthy. And of course, in Buddhism, the Buddha says, train your mind, keep training it, do these practices, do them every day, do them over and over and over. And eventually you'll create, and neuroscience is sort of finally catching up. Those scientists are so slow. The Buddha's been saying this 2,600 years ago. You can train your mind. Neuroscience is starting to kind of realize, oh yeah, you can actually create neural pathways of compassion. The mind doesn't have a lot of neural pathways of compassion, but through these practices, you can. I used the example that my father used of the melting of the rice paper. There's a sutta, and don't ask me to quote it because I can't remember what sutta number it is, but there's a sutta when somebody asks the Buddha, okay, how do these practices work? He's like, I'm, the loving kindness or the compassion or whatever. He says, I'm doing it, but I'm not really feeling it. So how does it work? He says, it's as though you took a drop of water, like if you had a slow drip of water and you were dropping it on a stone. If you keep dropping it in the same place over and over, eventually it'll create an indentation. Think of it as a sandstone, not like but a soft stone, and like your brain. And over and over, drip, drip, drip. And then eventually it creates not only an indentation, but a pathway for the water to roll down. And that's, the Buddha's way to explain neural pathways. You train your mind by repeating the practice over and over and over. May I learn compassion? May I learn compassion? May I learn compassion? May I respond with kindness? And eventually your mind starts getting it. Oh, kindness rather than aversion. Mercy rather than intolerance. Compassion rather than hatred. So mostly just that encouragement, to take on this kind of discipline. We all want to try to think our way. We've just met, but you've got a beautiful mind, but it's betraying you. Like all of our minds betray us. And we have to train it. We can't keep obeying it, and we can't keep believing it. Now, once you train your mind, and you've been practicing for some years, and you'll see it's starting to give you less bad advice, but it never stops. The Buddha said, I'm a fully enlightened being, and my mind keeps attacking. He called that part of his mind Mara. He said, even though I've fully awakened and I'm totally free from suffering and I meet all of the pain with compassion now, my mind still tells me I shouldn't. Then my mind still sometimes says, you should suffer about this. You should take this personal. So again, like the Dalai Lama's humility and the Buddha's humility, to give us a realistic idea of where we can get. Not to the place where you don't have pain, not to the place where your mind is perfectly wise and compassionate all of the time, but to the place where you no longer take the bad advice that your mind gives you. The Buddha returns to Mara and he says, I see you, to that part of his mind. He says, that's ignorance. I'm not going to meet this pain with hatred. That'll make it worse. I'm going to meet this pain with compassion because I learned how to do that. I'm going to take one online. Rick, go ahead, jump in.
Probably one of the oldest questions in the book on this subject, Noah, but I can't help but be reminded that bad actors and evildoers, when met with compassion, sometimes see that as license to continue bad acting and evil doing. I couldn't help but wonder, if the jury's compassionate to Officer Chauvin tomorrow, how are we going to feel about it?
Could you guys hear it? I'll repeat it. Rick said something like, if we meet, bad actors and, unskillful people with compassion, won't they kind of use that as a way to maybe cause more harm? And then he used the specific example of Officer Chauvin, the murderer of George Floyd. And he says, if the jury were compassionate tomorrow, wouldn't that, and let him off in this, wouldn't that, be a license for more people to act in terribly harmful ways? And so mostly what we're talking about here is a feeling of compassion. The appropriate response to Chauvin and everyone else is compassion. The appropriate response is compassion. Compassion, which means, oh, I see how confused you are. I see your suffering. I see your ignorance. I see, I see your pain, and I care about your pain. Now, even though I see your pain and I care about your pain, doesn't mean that you don't get consequences for your actions. Compassion doesn't obliterate someone's karma. And last week we were talking about equanimity and the karmic responsibility. Everyone's fully responsible for their actions. So this guy's karma likely is going to be prison, and who knows, in our corrupt and racist society, if it's a possibility that the jury, but that one, letting someone off like that isn't going to be, that's not a compassionate response, that's an ignorant response, right? That's a fear-based or a so compassion does not mean not having boundaries. Compassion does not mean not having consequences, not holding each other accountable for our actions. Now, often in our culture, we would say like, oh, I'm going to be compassionate and not, make you pay your debt or something like that, or generous and not make you pay your debt. But in that situation, from my opinion, that's a person who is accountable for his actions, and there should be consequences. And even with love, even with compassion, it wouldn't be compassionate actually for there not to be consequences. So does that make sense to you, Rick, when I talk about it in that way? That we're talking about developing a compassionate feeling for ourselves and each other. We're not talking about not having any boundaries or not having any laws or prisons or like actually, we need that shit. There needs to be, unfortunately, we live in a world where, most of the people in prison just need education and healing and trauma resolution and, not to be further wounded. And we don't live in a world that actually offers much resolution and much healing. But, people that act in incredibly unskillful ways, in my opinion, should be mandated into a intensive course in healing their wounds, because it's the wounds that are going to keep spilling out on each other. And there are some people who are sociopaths that you probably can't teach to be compassionate. And those people should be removed from society for sure.
That was really good. This is a really simply question for you said, I think you said something about have compassion for your brain, your thoughts, something like that. And the first thing in my mind is like fear, like when I'm in a perpetual state of fear. It's just like whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
I like the rice paper analogy for the heart, and I like the cooling analogy, kind of like visualization. It's really helpful. I was just wondering if you had any like techniques that you use, maybe like, I want to say mantras, more like Hindu stuff, but like any like repetitive mantras that are helpful for you to like have compassion and fear, like perpetual unwanted thoughts. Any techniques?
This is a great technique, I think. Could you hear him at home? The question is about, some practical ways to work with fear, repetitive fears. And I think this is a great practice to breathe it in, to turn towards it. I think I've mostly worked with fear around mindfulness, not so much with phrases or mantras, but more turning towards of like, where is it in my body? The kind of somatic Where is it? What's it doing in my jaw? What's it doing in my shoulders and my belly? And what happens when I soften to it? It's like seeing the story and then dropping into the body around fear, and seeing the anxious breathing and then taking a deep, long exhale. And sort of, I feel like my practice has been more of an embodied mindfulness around intimacy with fear, rather than quickly replacing it with because there is a danger with all of our practices where we can use them as aversion to what's happening. I don't want to feel this. I want to meditate it away. And I feel like with fear, what happened for me eventually, you've probably heard me talk about this before, is I started to just ask, like, okay, what's under this? What, expand, what's the core here? What am I afraid of? And I'm afraid of pain, every time. I'm afraid of something unpleasant happening, an unpleasant outcome. As they say in recovery, I'm afraid of losing something that I have, or not getting something that I want, or it's going to be unpleasant. And again, with all of these practices, the more we increase our tolerance for unpleasantness, it's one of the reasons I think that the death practice is in the first foundation, because ultimately fear is usually, can you track it back often to, like, I'm afraid that this is going to be so painful, it'll fucking kill me. If I lose this relationship, or if I don't get what I want, or it'll kill me. And then that's one of the reasons why we do a lot of, like, turn towards death, make friends with death, understand that death is inevitable, stop running from death. Now, we're not a death cult of kind of like, mass suicides or anything weird, but just an intimacy with, because when you break your fear of death, then anxiety can't get you that much anymore, because you're like, to your own mind, like, well, what are you afraid of? Some pain? I know how to tolerate pain. I know how to meet pain with mercy and compassion. I learned that. I created that. What am I afraid of? Now, there is healthy things to be afraid of, bodily injury, and, the whole kind of like, don't put your hand into the flame. Like, there's a healthy sense of, don't get, be afraid of getting burned, because you can avoid it, avoid the avoidable pains. But learning, so I don't know that I'm not probably giving you the mantra, the kind of phrases, but you could come up with your own. Like I said in the compassion, it's not a traditional phrase to say, may I learn to meet my pain with compassion. But I've used that a lot, especially in the early years where I wasn't feeling it. It was more of an aspiration. I'm not big on lying to ourselves, even in meditation practice, where, like, the difference between an aspiration and what are they called? The affirmation, where they're saying you're affirming something, but often it's totally not true. And you're saying this thing to yourself of, like, I am not afraid. And you're like, no, I'm fucking terrified. I am fearless. I am compassionate. I am filled with love. And then your mind is just like, no, you're terrified and filled with hatred. So more training the mind with aspirations, like, may I be at ease with the fears that arise, rather than taking them so personally. May I be at ease with the pain that comes and arises and passes. May I remember impermanence, right? That's a big one. Fear is often saying, this is going to last forever. All of there's that tendency of all of our difficult emotions, the brain to say, this one's gonna, none of the rest in the past have ever lasted all that long. I think there's some statistic that emotions actually can't last for more than like 90 seconds. But that's a long fucking 90 seconds when you're in fear for 90 seconds. And then it passes, and then it can re-arise, right? So it can feel pretty like I've been, suffering all day, but the reality is these thoughts and feelings are coming and going, coming and going, coming and going. So you could come up with your own just this sort of like, may I learn to be at ease with my fear? May I learn to tolerate my fear? May I learn to understand that whatever the mind is telling me is going to kill me probably isn't going to kill me, except for like, walking in front of a bus. That really will kill you. Be afraid of that. The practical stuff that's true, not the emotional sort of ego bruising that we're so afraid of.
I immediately noticed just the shallow breathing. So it's good to start with that.
In the body.
Notice how shallow my breathing was. I'm like, all right, so it's right there. Taking deep breaths. Starting with that.
Belly breaths, especially that abdominal full breaths. There's some somatically, when you take a deep breath, it does something to that nerve that runs down the basal vagus nerve or something, which kind of relaxes the mind. I'm not, I don't have all of the jargon for why those deep breaths work, but they work. Basal vega or some shit. Vagal. Vegas. You go to Vegas. Don't be nervous. Viva Las Vegas. There was another hand. Did we lose it? Yes. Any other thoughts, questions, comments about compassion? And, of course, my encouragement is to incorporate these kind of, if you're mostly doing like a mindfulness of your breath and you like that better. Ooh, you're like, I know sometimes people come to class and like, I don't want to do this breathing in suffering shit. Came here to relax. I want to come back to my breath and just be mindful and just ignore my mind. And I don't want to reflect on the pain of my life. And it's totally understandable that that's an understandable feeling, but this is such a key component. If you really want to be on the path, if you really want to be free from suffering, if you want to take, this path seriously, it's a key component. My sense is that I say it all the time, there's only 3 things you need to learn. This isn't true, by the way. There's probably more than 3, but the 3 core things you need to learn. The only wise response to pain is compassion, number 1, and learning to meet pain with compassion. These practices help that. The only wise response to the appropriate pleasures that present themselves in our life is non-attached appreciation, not clinging. And don't take your mind so personally, or your body, or each other. There's not such a solid self, right? That ego mind, and even Mara, those bad advice that the mind gives us, it's not your fault. Don't take it so personally. All 3 of these simple things will take the rest of our lives to develop more skill at being compassionate, more non-attachment, and less identification with the mind as self and personal. David, please.
It seems like one of the mind trainings that happens from doing something like TONGLEN, it helps me in just my walking around state to just be sensitized to suffering. Just in general, I just feel wiser and more in tune and more enlightened, whatever, when that is kind of what I'm walking around seeing. Not that I'm not seeing the beauty and the joy and whatever too, but it's just something that will immediately snap me out of my ego in a situation instead of, oh, this is an asshole. Oh, suffering.
Yes.
Like, oh, the pollution of even the suffering of the earth. It just like, it's this beautiful kind of chiropractic adjustment. And it feels like doing it in such a concentrated way in meditation does that mind training.
Yes.
and heart training.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't know if everybody could hear him at home, but just saying that the formal practice of Tonglen, these kind of practices, that then gets integrated into our daily life. We start to see through this lens of people aren't just jerks, they're suffering. People aren't just murderers, they're confused, suffering human beings. And it's so practical. And we suffer less at each other when we see through the surface manifestations of ignorance and see the underlying pain that's motivating all unskillful actions. So maybe that's enough for tonight. We can leave it there. I see that Jeff has posted the donations link in the chat. Thank you, Jeff and Emily, for assisting door people tonight on Zoom. Against the Stream is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is supported by the generosity of you as members, as part of the community, as what we call Sangha, part of the students and the community here. So just about everything, not everything, but just about everything is done by donation. The Monday night, the weekly classes are all donation-based. If you need a kind of ballpark $15 donation, would be appreciated if you can afford that, if that's in your budget, please do that. If you're in a place where you can't afford that for a drop-in class, give whatever feels appropriate to you. It's your own practice to practice generosity. It's an interesting, not that you have to do it here tonight or, but in your own mind, think of like if you had, a big stack of $1 bills and that you were actually doing mindfulness of like how it feels in your body to give $1 and like, $2, $3, and you get to $10. How does that feel? Does that feel generous? Does that feel like within my means, an appropriate? And then you get, and then maybe you have a lot of money. You feel like, $10, that doesn't feel like very generous, but 20 feels pretty generous, or 100 feels pretty generous. And that you actually do it as your practice of what it feels like, rather than this kind of fee for service. That one of the things that I'm trying to teach people, and that Buddhism has been trying to teach people for centuries, is how to give. Not just how to meditate, not just how to be compassionate, but how to be generous. And so that's part of your practice to donate in what feels generous to you. And that might be $2 for some of you. And it might be much more to others. If it feels annoying to give every time you come to class, one of the ways that you can is you can become a monthly supporter and just say, like, I'd rather just monthly, give this much money every month. So I'm not always putting cash or dealing with the Venmo. Or so on our website, and there's a link to it there in the chat, you can, or there's a thing there on the desk if you're here in person. You can say, I want to become a monthly supporter, and you can give $25 or $50 or $100 a month or $108 a month. Which really supports us and supports me as a teacher and pays the rent. And so please practice generosity. I have a day long on May 22nd. I hope you come. We're going to do a 9 a.m. to I think 4 or 5 p.m. day of practice with the community. I'll be offering meditation instructions. We'll be sitting and walking practices all day. You're all invited. You can register for that on the website. And I've scheduled a couple of residential retreats in Taos, New Mexico. I booked a retreat center out there. One in this fall and one this time next year in the spring. Not sure yet if I'm going to do those as Against the Stream retreats or refuge recovery retreats, maybe refuge recovery. Looking for a retreat center. I think we lost our Joshua Tree that I've been teaching at for, I guess, like 15 or 16 years. They're changing their policies and we might not be able to do retreats there. Maybe David will help me find a place in Ojai. I've always wanted to do some Ojai retreats. So looking for Against the Stream retreat for the fall, or as soon as we can. I'd do one this summer if we can find a place. that we can do a residential retreat as soon as they start allowing us to do that. Soon, coming soon. May any goodness that comes from our practice, discussion, the Buddha's Dharma, be shared outward in all directions. May each one of us uncover the compassionate heart. And together may we create a positive change on this planet. Next week, I'm going to talk about I think it's the 6 realms of existence and some Buddhist cosmology. And so it's one of my favorite talks, actually. So join me next week. See you guys then.